Chapter 21 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 21. Napoleon Bonaparte. There are only two names in history that are as great as conquerors and statesmen as that of Julius Caesar, of whom you have read in the present book. One of these two men was Alexander the Great, who lived hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, and the other was Napoleon Bonaparte, later called Bonaparte, and then Napoleon, who lived and died 100 years ago. Greater than Caesar, greater than Alexander, is the name of Napoleon. While Caesar was of noble birth and had all the advantages of position and authority in his favor, and while Alexander was a king and born to rule, Napoleon Bonaparte sprang from the humblest beginnings and had nothing to help him make his way except his own genius. While Alexander was little but a wonderful soldier, Napoleon Bonaparte was both a mighty soldier and a great statesman. And not only did he place himself upon a throne, but he made all the members of his family kings and princes. He was born on the island of Corsica in 1769, and was the fourth child and the youngest son of Charles Bonaparte, who lived in the town of Ajaccio, and was as poor as his neighbors, which, as he lived in Corsica, means that he was very poor indeed. Charles Bonaparte was an ardent Corsican patriot, and often plotted how Corsica could win her freedom from France. But nevertheless he held a French office, and was willing to send his sons to French schools. It was not long before Napoleon showed his family that he had the stubborn nature and iron will that would make him a great soldier. Before he was 10 years old, he dominated his brothers and sisters, and made them do as he said. He was afraid of nothing, and showed himself a natural leader among the children with whom he lived. As soon as he was old enough to talk, he desired to be a soldier, and when he was 10 years old, he was taken by his father to a military school in France. For 5 years Napoleon remained at this school at Brienne, mastering the military art. As he was gloomy and silent, he did not make friends easily. He was the butt of ridicule, and bore ill-natured jokes from the other young students there. But in spite of all this, all were a little afraid of him, and did not dare to provoke him too far. When Napoleon was 16 years old, his military education was considered to be finished, and he was given the commission of a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. In all these years he had only seen his father once, but Charles Bonaparte either had realized the greatness of his own son, or had one of those flashes of prophecy that sometimes come to dying men, for on his deathbed he cried out, asking for the son Napoleon, whose sword, he said, was to shake the earth, and who was to make himself the master of all Europe. It was not too many years after the young officer had joined his regiment that he had a chance to distinguish himself. This was at the siege of a town called Toulon. All France was in upheaval at that time, for the people had revolted against their rulers, and had overthrown their king and their nobility. Their King Louis XVI perished on the public scaffold under the knife of the guillotine, and the French revolutionists had carried on such a reign of terror that all Europe was in turmoil, and the hand of almost every other nation in the world was against the French. Even a number of the French themselves were opposed to their own government, and had placed the town of Toulon at the disposal of the English and their allies. It was this town that the French army was endeavoring to take, and a long and unsuccessful siege had been carried on, for Toulon was strongly defended. Until Napoleon Bonaparte came, the French accomplished little. But Napoleon soon changed the look of the siege. Young as he was, he had command of all the artillery that was being used against the town, and his military genius soon made itself felt, for he gave his orders with lightning rapidity, and saw that they were carried out with a skill that amazed the other officers. Due to his efforts and the skillful arrangement of the cannon at his disposal, the most important strong points of the town fell into French hands. The British fleet, which was cooperating with the besieged, was driven off, and Toulon was captured. But this piece of work did not bring Napoleon any immediate or great reward. In fact, it was not long before he was out of favor with the revolutionary government, and his commission as an officer taken from him. He had formed a friendship with the brother of Robespierre, a revolutionary leader who came under the displeasure of the Republic, and when Napoleon was offered a command of infantry, he refused to accept it, and thus found himself outside the profession that he had chosen. However, his skill at Toulon was soon to give him the opportunity he sought, for one of the members of the revolutionary government had noticed his ability and resolved to call upon him in time of need. This time soon came, for rioting and bloodshed broke out in Paris, and the people sought to overthrow the government. Then Napoleon was called on to protect the palace of the Tuileries, where the offices of the French government were located. Here Napoleon showed the stuff he was made of. Although he was given the appointment late in the day, the next morning saw cannon trained on all the avenues approaching the Tuileries, and the cannoneers standing like statues with lighted matches ready to fire upon the slightest provocation. When the Parisian mob, armed with clubs, pistols, and old muskets, advanced to storm the palace, Napoleon waited until some shots had been fired, and then gave a sharp command. With a roar of cannon, a storm of death swept down the avenues, and the people scattered like chaff, leaving many dead and wounded behind them. The government had been saved due to the prompt action of the young artillery officer, and was properly grateful. Napoleon was given an important command. He received a general's rank, and was put in charge of the army of the interior. It was at this time that he met a beautiful widow named Josephine de Beauharnais, with whom he promptly fell in love. Through Barras, the official who had brought him into prominence, the match was arranged, and Napoleon was married to Josephine. But the young officer had already started upon his career of greatness, and did not have much time to celebrate his nuptials. While on leave, and even when engaged in other duties, he had found opportunity to study the situation in Italy, where many forces hostile to the French Republic were gathered. He had even formed a plan by which the French could invade Italy, and it was now suggested to the directors of the French government that he himself be allowed to put this plan into execution. They consented, and hurrying to the south of France, with only 2 days after his wedding, Napoleon took charge of a French army of about 50,000 ragged and ill-fed soldiers. His men had not been paid for months, and there was practically no discipline among them. They were sick and discouraged, worn out with fighting the battles of the revolutionary party without reward. But when Napoleon appeared among them, their spirits rose as though by magic, for the young commander knew how to appeal to their imagination and to awaken their fighting instinct. "Soldiers," he said to them, "you are half starved and half naked. The government owes you much, but can do nothing for you. I am about to lead you into the most fertile valleys of the world. There you will find flourishing cities and teeming provinces. There you will reap honor, glory, and riches. Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you lack courage?" In Italy were the Austrians and the Sardinians, against whom Napoleon was to fight. He did not attempt to cross the Alps, as the great general Hannibal had done in ancient times. Instead of this, he skirted the Alps, and fell upon the enemy so rapidly that they were not prepared to meet him. With a series of brilliant marches and maneuvers, he divided the forces of his enemy, and compelled the Sardinians to sign an armistice, although the French government had given him no authority to take so much power into his own hands. He then drove back the Austrians, and defeated them in the battle of Lodi, where he carried a standard with his own hands, and rallied his troops in the face of withering fire. The Austrians were completely defeated, and numbered their dead by the thousands. And so delighted were the French soldiers by their success, that they gave to the name of their young commander the title of the Little Corporal. Napoleon, however, did not let the grass grow under his heels, for in war he believed that victory almost always came to the commander who struck first. Time was everything, he declared, and advancing swiftly, he laid siege to the town of Mantua, defeated several armies that were sent to relieve it, and brought all Italy under his control. And now the directors of the French government learned that the young general they had placed in command of the army of Italy was made of very different material from the average general who obeyed their orders. Napoleon treated them haughtily, and made demands rather than requests from them. He had already exceeded his power many times, and had treated with the rulers and the commanders of the enemies he had beaten as though he himself were the ruler of France. Indeed, his soldiers talked frequently of making him such, and declared they would rather have a general like Napoleon as their king and be his subjects, than to be governed by a group of civilian clerks who knew nothing of war and had to rely on others to carry out their wishes. It may be sure that Napoleon did not discourage this feeling among his soldiers, for he designed to make himself the ruler of France. The time had not yet come, however, for him to reveal his intentions openly, although it is true they were but thinly disguised. After he had negotiated with Austria for peace and arranged the armistice with Sardinia, Napoleon returned to Paris, carrying with him many priceless paintings and works of art taken from the states that he had conquered. These were placed in the galleries of the Louvre in Paris, which at once became the most wonderful picture galleries in the world. But the directors of the French government were afraid of the young conqueror, who was acclaimed by the people wherever he went, and desiring to get rid of him, they readily gave their consent to a plan that Napoleon himself suggested. This was that since France was still at war with England, and not strong enough to invade that country, Napoleon should strike at her by taking an army to conquer Egypt, and thus do injury to England's trade with her eastern possessions in India, by opening a road to invade that far country which was the source of England's power. Preparations for the expedition were conducted with great secrecy in Toulon, the same town that he had captured a few years before. And in May of 1798, Napoleon set sail with a large fleet that contained about 35,000 of his best soldiers and his most clever and trustworthy officers. On landing in Egypt, he lost no time but quickly captured Alexandria and marched into the desert. The Mamelukes, who had fought against Napoleon, although undisciplined and savage, were nevertheless brave fighters. Their cavalry was far famed for its bravery and skill at horsemanship, as well as for rich trappings and costly equipment. Bravely the Mamelukes charged against the French, and time after time they recoiled from the squares of glittering bayonets on which riders and horses were impaled. But at last they weakened, and the French charged in their turn, and from an unexpected quarter. The battle was over. Napoleon's keen eye had seen that the artillery of the Mamelukes had no wheels and was moved with difficulty, and he arranged his men accordingly. But while Napoleon succeeded on land, he had been cut off from returning to France, for the English admiral, Lord Nelson, had defeated the French fleet. Napoleon fought and won battles against the Turks, but his force was too small and the odds against him too great for him to succeed in an eastern campaign, cut off as he was by the English. And while he was in this difficult situation, word was brought to him that war had broken out again in Italy, and all his work there had been undone. It was imperative, if he wished to hold his power in France, that he should make his way to Paris without delay. So Napoleon left his men in charge of one of his generals, and with only a few followers embarked at Alexandria. His ship eluded the English fleet, which was cruising the Mediterranean Sea, and he made his way to Paris with all speed. France at this time was governed by a Directory and a Council of 500. This was one of the forms of revolutionary government that had been adopted after the French had dethroned and slain their king. Napoleon believed that the time had come for him to seize the chief position in the French government, but he did not dare as yet openly to have himself proclaimed as king. With his brother Lucian and his advisor Talleyrand, Although Napoleon did not accept advice as a rule, but was guided by his own bold, brilliant ideas, he overthrew the Council of 500 and abolished the Directory. Then he established what was called the Provisional Government, which was headed by a group of 3 men, who were called consuls. Naturally, Napoleon was the first and most important of these, and took care to see that the bulk of the power wielded by the consuls should remain in his hands. Clever, bold, and brilliant, stopping at nothing, with a solid backing of the army and a brain greater than any that had been known on this earth in hundreds of years, it seemed as though this Superman could accomplish anything he desired. After he had attained his ends in Paris, he went again into the field to meet his enemies. There was no immediate fear that France would be invaded, for while the Austrians had won victories in Italy and freed that country from French control, for which they substituted their own, a French general named Massena had won a victory in Switzerland that had shaken the grip of his enemies. It was necessary, however, that Italy be invaded a second time, and this time Napoleon made his plans to cross the Alps as Hannibal had done 2,000 years before. With his supplies on pack mules, with cannon wheels carried by his soldiers, and the men themselves drawing the cannon on rude sleds improvised from tree trunks, the indomitable commander crossed the mighty mountain range that stood in his way, and suddenly appeared on the Italian plains, in a part of the country where the Austrians had not dreamed that he would arrive. Before they were able to collect and rearrange their forces, Napoleon struck and defeated them in the Battle of Marengo, where his men fought against odds of 3 to 1. Other battles followed, and French generals invaded Austria. There remained nothing for the Austrians to do but sue for peace. England soon followed her example, and France was at peace with the world. Then Napoleon busied himself with internal matters and set about reorganizing the French government and framing a code of laws that might be used thereafter by the country that he had made his own. This was called the Code Napoleon, and it is largely used today in France, for Napoleon's genius as a lawmaker and a ruler was almost as great as his power of generalship. He did not know such a word as failure, but succeeded in everything he put his hand to. While whole libraries had been written about him, there seemed to be 3 main reasons for his gigantic successes. The first is that he was a natural genius, with far superior mental power to any other man of his time. The second is that he had wonderful ability to work hard, and the third is that he knew how to draw to himself the loyalty and affection of the ablest men of his day, and make their achievements further stepping stones to his own successes. He had studied his trade of soldiering since he was old enough to talk. He had worked at it constantly and toiled so incessantly that he seldom slept more than 3 or 4 hours a night. Moreover, in the troubled times in which Napoleon appeared on the international stage, France was ripe for just such leadership and indomitable will power as he was able to supply. Fortune favored his efforts as much as he favored himself. The peace that had come to Europe did not last long. In the treaties that had been framed, Napoleon had taken care to include affairs that would furnish him with new excuses to make war whenever he desired. And now he went to war again with England, and made plans for invading that country which he hated above all others. He had become so powerful by this time that he desired to wear the crown of France. Accordingly, he made arrangements for a brilliant coronation, and invited Pope Pius VIII to place the crown upon his head. As there was still much hatred in France of the word king, Napoleon decided to assume the title of emperor. On December 2nd, 1804, before a most brilliant assembly of people, Napoleon and Josephine were crowned. When the Pope approached to place the crown on Napoleon's head, he rose quickly, took the crown from the Pope's hand, and placed it on his head himself, while a gasp of astonishment ran through the audience. He then removed it and placed it on the head of Josephine, who sat on the throne beside him. As the crown touched Napoleon's brow, Paris re-echoed to the thunder of guns and to deafening cheers and cries of "Long live the Emperor!" Grim old soldiers, who had followed him in many bitter campaigns, embraced each other and got drunk in the wine shops. There was a wild time of revel and celebration. The French people forgot the Revolution, in which thousands had died just to prevent the rule of kings. They thought of nothing but their new ruler, who had made France the mistress of the world, and was to lead his armies to even greater victories. And it seemed that Napoleon would need more victories to keep his power. Through the tireless efforts of the English statesman Pitt, Russia and Austria had joined England against him. Other countries were secretly in league with these allies, and war was again to shake the entire world. As we have said, Napoleon had planned to invade England, and so certain was he of success that he had a monument erected celebrating the future invasion. But to secure the results and to transport his army safely into England, it was necessary for Napoleon to have mastery of the English Channel, which was controlled by British warships under Lord Nelson, who, as you remember, had cut off and defeated Napoleon at sea when he was engaged in the invasion of Egypt. And while arrangements were completed for carrying a large French army from Boulogne to the English shores, a mishap befell Napoleon that forever prevented him from realizing his dream of British invasion. The French fleet under Admiral Villeneuve met Lord Nelson off Trafalgar and was utterly defeated. Napoleon's chance to invade England was gone forever. With his genius, however, for changing failure into success, Napoleon had already turned his designs elsewhere. With the splendid army with which he contemplated the humiliation of England, he now marched against Austria. After defeating the Austrians in several engagements, Napoleon met the combined Russian and Austrian forces at Austerlitz on the anniversary of the day on which he had been crowned as emperor. And fortune, which had crowned him then in Paris, now crowned his genius on the battlefield by the greatest of all his victories. After prodigious slaughter, the Russians and Austrians were completely routed, losing thousands of prisoners. The Treaty of Pressburg followed, in which the Austrian Emperor Francis I was compelled to give up large slices of his territory to France, and the Russians as quickly as possible withdrew into their own country. But this was only the beginning of the wars that Napoleon thenceforward was engaged in. The kingdom of Prussia declared war against France, and Napoleon marched against the Prussians and defeated them at the Battle of Jena. Russia, however, was ready to make peace with France, for after Jena, Napoleon turned his attention to the Russians and defeated them at Friedland. Then the Tsar of Russia and Napoleon met on a raft which was anchored in the middle of the river Niemen, and swore eternal friendship. This was called the Treaty of Tilsit. As England was now the only great nation that continued to be the enemy of France, Napoleon had made arrangements in this treaty that were designed to cripple England's trade and do as much damage to her as was possible. Moreover, the conqueror then decided that henceforth there were to be no neutral nations. Either the other countries must aid him in his trade war against England, and in other ways, should he desire, or take the consequences of braving his anger. With this policy in his mind, Portugal was invaded, and the royal family was driven from the country to South America, where they sought refuge in the country of Brazil. Spain had sided with France against Portugal, but Napoleon then humiliated and dominated Spain. He used a far greater number of men than was necessary for his Portuguese invasion, and turned them against the Spaniards, many of whose most important forts had been taken by the French soldiers through treachery as well as by stratagem. When the conquest of Spain was ended, Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Austria, however, was preparing for another struggle against Napoleon. Though continually defeated by the French, the Austrians lost no chance of turning on them or taking any opportunity that might bring success against the victorious soldiers of Napoleon. But this only brought upon the Austrians the further defeat of Wagram and the loss of additional territory to Napoleon. But now fortune began to go against the brilliant soldier, who had seldom lost a battle and practically never had been defeated. The Russians did not like the alliance with France that had been imposed upon them at Tilsit, and in spite of the Tsar's vows of friendship, were ready to turn against Napoleon on the first opportunity. In fact, the Tsar had become directly angered at Napoleon for the following reason. Although Napoleon had made himself emperor, there was no heir to the French throne, as it seemed that Josephine would remain childless. Napoleon conceived the plan of divorcing her and marrying some high-born lady whose alliance with him would strengthen the bonds between her country and that of the French. He had negotiated with a Russian Tsar for the hand of a Russian princess, but before the arrangements had been completed, he married an Austrian duchess named Marie Louise. This turned Russia into the scale against Napoleon, who had already dealt with the Russians in a high-handed manner. So the Tsar entered into a close alliance with England against the conqueror. Then Napoleon made the greatest mistake of all his brilliant career. With all Europe in unrest against him, he nevertheless conceived the plan of invading Russia and raised a great army for this purpose. Russia was and is one of the most difficult countries in all of Europe in which to carry on a military invasion. The country is so cold and barren, and the distances are so great, that any invading army had great difficulty in transporting its supplies and marching the required distances. Napoleon had almost always relied for his supplies on the countries he had conquered, and believed that it was always possible for large armies to subsist on forage and the supplies of the conquered inhabitants. To a large extent he used this policy in his invasion of Russia, and it brought about his downfall. With an army of 400,000 men he entered Russia and advanced into the interior. The Russians constantly retreated before him and laid waste everything in his path. Towns were burned, crops were destroyed, and cattle driven away, as Napoleon led his forces toward the ancient and historic city of Moscow. When the French had advanced a long distance into Russia, the Russian general named Kutuzov offered them battle in a place called Borodino. It was a stubborn and bloody conflict, and more lives were lost both by the Russians and by the French than in any previous battle Napoleon had engaged in. The Russians then continued to retreat, and Napoleon entered Moscow on the 14th of September, 1812. Here the French believed that they would find respite from the hardships that they had encountered, and sufficient food and grain to feed their army. But their hopes were short-lived, and in Moscow a great disaster befell them. Flames broke out in the city on the first night of their occupation, and were extinguished with difficulty. On the next night fires were kindled by hidden Russians in 100 different places, and at last the city was a sea of flames, in which no man could live. Napoleon had gained nothing by his invasion except to conquer a devastated country, and now, with winter coming on, he was compelled to retreat again toward the Russian frontier. The plight of the French army had become fearful. Without food and with insufficient clothing, they were compelled to face the rigors of a Russian winter. As they retreated, the Russians followed them, and bands of wild Cossacks harassed their rear and their flanks, cutting off and killing any stragglers. Even the Russian peasants took part in the pursuit, and slew the exhausted French with their flails and cudgels. Thousands of soldiers froze to death. In crossing the Beresina River, thousands more were drowned. When they approached the frontier, Napoleon left the pitiful remnant of his shattered army to Marshal Ney, one of the bravest of his generals, while he himself, in a swift sleigh, hastened to Paris to raise another army before all Europe knew of what had happened. For as soon as they did know, they would take up arms against him, thinking that in his weakened condition they could overthrow his power. Of the 400,000 that entered Russia, only 20,000 returned. More than 1/3 brave men had left their bones on the chill snows and iron earth of the land they sought to humble. Uprisings, alliances, and campaigns by the hitherto beaten nations followed. Napoleon won the battle of Lutzen, but the English Duke of Wellington defeated the French at Vittoria. At last, in the great battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the French were routed. In the following year the Allies made ready to crush Napoleon. He was now on the defensive, with enemies hemming him in on every side. And although he fought a brilliant campaign, it was hopeless. On April 11th, 1814, Napoleon was compelled to resign the crown and obliged to go into exile, and the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea was chosen as the place for him to end his days. For the last time before his exile, Napoleon addressed his soldiers in farewell, and the tears ran down the rough cheeks of the veterans as they bade good-bye to the man who had so often led them to victory. And then Napoleon passed through southern France, on his way to Elba, amid the hisses and execrations of his people, who had already forgotten the victories he had won for France, and thought now only of their misery and the dear ones they had lost on the barren snowfields of Russia. Instead of Napoleon, the brother of the former king, Louis XVI, was placed on the throne of France. An old, fat, wheezy man of no particular ability. It seemed as if the great conqueror was downed at last. But Napoleon intended differently. As he stayed at Elba, surrounded by a little court and with the title of emperor which the Allies had allowed him to keep, he kept looking toward the coast of France and plotting how to return. It is more than probable that his life was in danger at Elba. At all events, he found the life intolerable, and desired once again to play the leading part in European affairs. In the meantime, the French people grew weary of fat old Louis XVIII, whose name of Louis de Witt was changed by the French into a joke, into Louis des Huit, or Louis of the oysters, so fond was the old gourmand of his shellfish. They began to sigh for Napoleon and look forward to the spring when they hoped he might be able to escape from his island of confinement and rejoin his soldiers in Paris, and this very thing soon happened. Napoleon made a successful plan to escape from Elba, and was concealed on a ship bound for France. And on the short trip back to the French coast, he gave a striking example of his remarkable coolness and the certainty in which he held his future fortune. A passing vessel hailed his ship, asking, among other things, what was the latest news of the emperor. Napoleon, who was too far off to be recognized, laughingly took the speaking trumpet from the captain's hand and shouted back, "The emperor is very well," and both vessels passed on their way. Landing with a few followers near Cannes in southern France, Napoleon hastened northward with a small army that he had been allowed to keep at Elba. An army had been sent against him by the French, but Napoleon had no intention of fighting it. Instead, he advanced alone upon his former soldiers, many of whom recognized him and rejoiced at the sight of their former leader. When he drew near, Napoleon threw back his coat and shouted that if any man desired to kill his emperor, now was his opportunity. Instead of killing him, the soldiers crowded around him with cries of joy. The whole army went over to his cause, and Marshal Ney, who had been sent against him, and who had sworn that he would bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, could not withstand the sight of his old general, and threw his lot once more with the imperial eagles. With a force that increased at every mile, Napoleon marched toward Paris, while Louis XVIII hastily gathered up his luggage and fled into Belgium. As soon as the Allies learned of Napoleon's escape, they hastened to make war against him. But Napoleon did not wait for them. With a splendid army at his heels, he marched to the north to meet his foes. Fate was too strong for him, however. On June 16, 1815, he fought the Battle of Ligny, in which he defeated the Prussians, but 2 days later engaged in one of the most famous struggles of all history, the Battle of Waterloo. Here Napoleon was pitted against the English under Lords Wellington and the Prussians under Blucher. All day the struggle went on with success in the balance, and time after time it seemed as if nothing could save the English army from the furious charges of Napoleon's cuirassiers and heavy dragoons. Blucher had been separated from Wellington before the battle opened, and due to muddy roads he was late in arriving with the reinforcements that were necessary for an English victory. When he did appear, however, the battle was won for the Allies. The French broke and scattered in headlong rout, and were followed throughout the night by the ruthless Prussians, who cut them down without mercy. The splendid army that Napoleon had gathered was no more. Napoleon fled to Paris, and from there to Rochefort in southern France, where he was ordered to leave the country without delay. Now that he was defeated, the French were unwilling to harbor him, for they knew that his presence meant continued war with the victorious Allies. At last Napoleon surrendered himself to the commander of the British warship Bellerophon, and was taken to England as a prisoner. The English did not even allow him to land. He was transferred to another vessel and carried to a lonely and rocky island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. Here, with a few of his followers who remained faithful to him in his misfortune, the great emperor fretted away the remainder of his life. On May 5th, 1821, just as the sunset gun was fired, he breathed his last. He was buried in St. Helena, but his body was later claimed by the French government, and now rests in state in Paris, in a wonderful sarcophagus of red marble beneath the dome of the Hôtel des Invalides. In recesses of this building are also the tombs of Marshal Ney and the other great generals who had best served their emperor in his lifetime. End of chapter 21.